Welcome. This is the Ecomodernist podcast. Our philosophy is based on sound science and free from the outdated dogmas of the 20th century.
Hi, this is Gabe Ignetti.
And this is Rick Maltese.
And this is the Ecomodernist podcast. Nuclear power has become a villain in popular culture and among much of the environmental community. Yet the next generation of reactors currently in development may actually be key to avoiding global catastrophe. Our show today will be about a movie that has recently debuted at the Heartland Festival called The New Fire. This film focuses on the generation facing the most severe impacts of climate change and how it is fighting back with ingenuity and hope. Our show today will be in two parts. The first part will have Emmy Award-winning director David Schumacher, whose talent and innovation made this film possible, followed by Dr. Leslie Dewan of Transatomic, who was one of the stars of this film. Dave, we'd like to welcome you to our show. Could you tell us a little bit about this movie?
Sure thing, Gabe. So the movie is about the young entrepreneurs that are developing the next generation of nuclear reactors and the promise of this technology and the implications as we address climate change.
And what led you to embark on this project?
So I was just really concerned about climate change and kind of a little skeptical about how we were going to actually reach those climate goals that have been identified at all. And so as I looked into it, I was sort of surprised to see that the climate scientists, by practically a consensus, have said nuclear has to play a big role in the future energy mix if we're going to have a good shot at reaching those goals. I wasn't a big nuclear person at that time, and so I started to look into sort of what was happening in the world of nuclear, and I was aware previously of TerraPower, a company that Bill Gates had founded some years earlier, and so I looked back to see, okay, well, they're still going, but there's a bunch of other nuclear companies. You think of a nuclear company, you're thinking about a big, large public corporation, and so it was really surprising to see that these are actually startups, and a lot of times they're young people just right out of school and deciding this is what they want to do right out of the gate. And so that was really interesting to me. And so I felt it's a really important story, and we really have to look at how are we going to decarbonize. And I felt like I saw a way to put a story together that works in a film that might be interesting to audiences and that might get audiences to engage on this issue in a way that maybe they hadn't previously.
Is this movie being funded by the nuclear industry?
I have zero connection with the nuclear industry, and not that that's any issue that I would care about one way or the other, but I'm making a film because I'm really concerned about climate, and nobody's talking about nuclear. Nuclear doesn't exist as far as the world of clean energy is concerned, and the narrative out there in public. How are we addressing climate change? If you look at any of the movies that have come out in the last year or two about climate, and even before then, generally it's all about solar panels, it's about wind, it's about efficiency, batteries, hydro, renewables. That's the narrative. Nuclear doesn't even exist. Nobody even talks about it. Even though the majority of the United States clean energy comes from nuclear, they don't talk about it as being what we're going to continue using in the future. So that's why I'm making this film. It's not that I'm not interested in all the other technologies there are out there, wind, solar. Those are really important and need to grow a lot without question. And maybe if everyone was only talking about nuclear and they weren't talking about other potentially important sources of clean energy, maybe this film would be about those sources instead. I don't know. But that's not the case. It's not like I'm nuclear or bust. It's just that this is the story that needs to be told. We need all the options on the table, and this is the one that's the most underserved, and this is the one that I think people need to sort of be reintroduced to, because it does have a big role to play.
A big part of this movie introduces the public to the emerging pro-nuclear movement. What is your assessment of the impact this small but growing movement is or is not making?
Well, it's pretty early on. I think there's been a sort of institutional or larger scale traditional sort of pro-nuclear effort in the civil society side and the think tank world for the past few years. And that's, I suppose, made definitely some impact. I mean, it's definitely been the main driver, I think, of nuclear innovation and sort of waving the flag for advanced nuclear out there in the world. And I don't know that that's making anywhere near the type of impact that we need when you're talking about the scale of the problem that we're facing here and the potential and what it takes to really get it going. I think that they're putting forth a lot of good ideas and a lot of logical proposals, but it becomes a policy question. It becomes a question of funding and regulations, and that takes political capital. And I think that political capital comes from people. And so I think that what's really exciting right now is that there are sort of grassroots groups coming up that are supporting nuclear, and they're very, very small, but they're very energized and very exciting, frankly. And so it remains to be seen what's going to happen. I mean, we're just at the very earliest times for these groups, like, for example, Generation Atomic. And I'm very optimistic and hopeful about those groups and their mission, because I feel like it's really going to take grassroots efforts to drive change that I think is necessary if we're going to see this type of innovation and growth and development in this sector at the rate and scale that I think is going to be necessary.
I think a successful documentary could make a big difference. So what's next for the new fire, and where can we go see it? I'm wondering if it'll reach Toronto.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'd love to bring it to Toronto or Canada. I grew up in Canada. There's a lot of great stuff happening in Canada, actually, in the advanced nuclear space. And so I think that it would mean a lot to me to be able to bring the film up there. Unfortunately, we haven't really connected on the festival side, and we are in festival mode right now. It's an independent documentary, so the film has not been released commercially. So for the next several months, the way to see the film is going to be either at a festival or at an ad hoc screening that someone might have arranged, or even private screening that you could arrange if you want. And just reach out, info@newfiremovie.com, and we can figure out ways to set up screenings as needed. For example, we were approached about doing a screening in Switzerland and have a German version of the film. So we made a German subtitled version of the film, which will be shown in Zurich on the 23rd of October. I'm really excited about that screening now. And then once the commercial distribution system is all sorted out, which is something that comes out of the festival circuit, that's kind of why we do it, because that's kind of the market for independent films as far as distribution and so forth is concerned. Then away we go. We'll be announcing broadcast or any other theatrical or non-theatrical distribution avenues, and I would expect that that would start to happen in 2018. But for the time being, I'm just having a great time setting up these screenings and getting ready to leave in a couple days for the Cambridge International Film Festival, international premiere in Cambridge, England. That's going to be pretty cool. So really excited about taking the film out there on the road. And there's going to be screenings at the Ojai Festival in California, the Denver Film Festival, St. Louis Film Festival, and my hometown here, New York, Doc NYC. There's going to be screening there. And this is all happening in the first part of November. There's a bunch more screenings in November, and then we'll be announcing more in the weeks and months to come.
I can approach Hot Docs. We have in Toronto Hot Docs, it's called. And
great festival.
They have documentaries all year round, and I should probably help you out there. I'll check your website out. Say the name of the website one more time.
Sure.
info@newfiremovie.com. Great. Yeah, Hot Docs I think was in June or something. I think it was in June. But yeah, maybe Hot Docs next year could be a possibility. So that sounds great.
You know, I think it would be wonderful if this movie was translated into other languages as well.
That type of thing is definitely possible. It does cost some money.
You should really think about translating it into Spanish. Spanish is the second language in the United States. In fact, it's the second most spoken language on the planet, even ahead of English.
Well, I guess, yeah. I don't know where we would play it, but do you have a the place to play it in Spanish?
Yeah, there are places all over the country you could play it. Parts of Texas, Florida, California. Right in Miami, where I live, tons of people don't speak any English.
Great. Well, if somebody invites us to screen it in Miami and sets up a screening, I mean, that's totally, it could be just like Zurich. That would be, it's kind of, that's kind of a made to order type of thing, and I'd love to do that. I mean, that's kind of the thing about making this film, is that it's great if I say, I want to do this and I want to do a Spanish version, or I'd love to do a Korean version. I think it would be great to take the film to South Korea right about now and show it to folks there, for example. This is an independent film. I mean, I am not independently wealthy. I have not got any resources to put into doing any kind of distribution on this film at all, or any kind of screenings at all. So really, that's kind of where other people have to step up and say, we see the value in something like this, so we're going to actually sponsor this type of a use of the film. What do you want to do with it? Do you want to show it to a certain community? Then great, let's set it up. I mean, I think we have a screening actually lined up in April for the ANS student conference in Gainesville, or at the University of Florida. And so that's actually going to be a Florida screening in April. That's a ways off. But I'm really excited about that, because it's great to get together with young folks. I mean, this is what it's all about, is that next generation. This is really a film for them, and any chance I have to put it in front of young people that are really interested in climate and energy is a great thing, I think. But yeah, it's all about getting sponsors. This film isn't going to be translated by itself. It's not going to go and be distributed by itself. It's all because there's people that understand the value of getting this kind of message out there, that they themselves may not be filmmakers, but they have a role to play, and that's in sort of like supporting that kind of a rollout and that kind of use of the film. And so that's kind of the tricky part. There isn't really an established pro-nuclear philanthropic network out there of people that are really looking to engage the public on this kind of way. And so we're just sort of building that. And we've been very fortunate to have some visionary folks get behind this project who understood the value of something like this for engaging with the public and telling this positive story. And I think that that's what needs to, continue happening. If you want to have a screening, well, let's make it happen. But it's not just going to happen by snapping your fingers. It costs money. I'd love to take this film across the country to all kinds of colleges. I think that would be great. But that needs to be underwritten by somebody. So this is kind of the challenge, is this is so new that kind of network doesn't exist yet, or it's only in its earliest stages. It's nascent at this point. And so that's something I think we need to really think about. I've got the film here, but it's not really build it and they will come. It's more like build it, and then what can we do with it? How can we use this to sort of help other efforts to drive the kinds of outcomes we'd like to see?
You're so right about that. You know, what you said reminds me of the Smokey the Bear commercials I heard in my youth, where they said it only takes one match to start a forest fire. I think the pro-nuclear movement has a golden opportunity here to have small showings, to give donations. That spark is in all of us. We want to thank you, Dave Schumacher, for taking the time to be on our show today.
Hey, my pleasure.
In this next part of our show, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Leslie Dewan of Transatomic. Dr. Dewan, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. I'm doing well, and I'm really excited to be on the podcast with you all today.
You were a star of this movie, The New Fire.
It was wonderful working with Dave Schumacher on this, and the timing worked out so well. The majority of the filming happened in 2015, and it captured such an interesting time for our company. We went from 2 people up to, 6 full-time plus a large number of other consultants, and moved into our new office and then moved into a bigger office. Fun that he was able to capture this really crucial and really interesting time. And it was wonderful working with Dave.
Let's talk about the new cutting-edge technology known as Gen 4 nuclear reactors. Could you tell us just what a Gen 4 reactor is?
Absolutely, Gabe. So Generation 4 reactors are a suite of new fission reactor technologies that are substantially different from the conventional nuclear reactors that operate today. They're also known as advanced nuclear reactors. And so these are reactors that are, for example, cooled by liquid metal rather than water, or use liquid fuel even rather than solid fuel, or operate at very, very high temperatures to increase their overall efficiency. And the cool thing about these, like, these are truly a revolutionary change from the previous generation of reactor designs. And they therefore have the potential to solve some of the big traditional problems that have plagued other types of nuclear reactor technologies over the past few decades. So these Gen 4 nuclear reactors can potentially be lower cost and have increased safety benefits, greater proliferation resistance, and decreased waste production. And one of the especially cool things to me about Generation 4 reactors is that even though they're all very, very new technology, they're in many cases based on technology from the very early days of the industry. So their genesis is from the 1950s, the 1960s, this older type of technology, but updated with modern materials and modern computational tools to bring them into a new era.
Very good. You partly answered my next question, but what makes the molten salt reactor so special?
One of the especially great things about molten salt reactors is that they use liquid fuel rather than solid fuel. And the liquid fuel gives them substantially different cooling requirements from the conventional light water reactors that exist today. So this means that the molten salt reactors effectively can't melt down, even in the worst case scenario. If, for example, you lose off-site power to a molten salt reactor, the liquid fuel can effectively freeze solid over the course of a few hours. So in a molten salt reactor, if you have an accident, it fails in a solid mode rather than a liquid or gaseous mode. And molten salt reactors also operate at atmospheric pressure, so you don't have any type of large driving force that could potentially push radioactive material beyond the site boundary. So from my perspective, one of the most significant benefits of molten salt reactors are their substantially increased safety benefits.
Salt reacts badly with oxygen and fire. So is there more of a fire danger, or what happens if there is a fire in terms of radioactive fallout or whatever?
So there's a risk with some of the reactors, like sodium-cooled reactors, for example, can have a fire risk when they encounter water in the air. So like metallic sodium, for example, if it comes up against either liquid water or water in the air, it can have a very, very strong exothermic reaction. With the molten salt reactors in particular, since you don't have free sodium or free lithium, they don't have that type of explosive reaction. And that's not to say that there's a risk of explosion with the sodium fast reactors or that type of sodium cooled reactors. There's very substantial operating experience with that type of liquid metal cooled reactors. So there's a good sense to how to handle those safely and properly. And those have been handled for many decades now. Transatomic is a molten salt reactor design company. And so we're working on the type of liquid fueled reactors, and that's distinct from the sodium cooled reactor technologies.
Okay. Let me ask you this. How much of a game changer could Gen 4 be? And in particular, the MSR, I mean, in terms of costs, in terms of what can be done with nuclear energy and what could be done with cheaper energy?
One of the most exciting things to me about Generation 4 reactors is that they have the potential to be much lower cost than existing nuclear technology. They can be cheaper than fossil fuels. They can be cheaper than coal in particular. So if you develop the right type of Gen 4 nuclear technology, you can make a strong economic argument that's in favor of nuclear. And I think that's especially important for rapidly developing countries like China and India in particular. You need to make sure that the economic incentives for building a new type of power plant is in line with what's good for the environment. So you want to make sure that the lowest cost option is also a carbon-free option. And I think that can be a Gen 4 nuclear plant.
I understand, too, that they are hot enough that they could be used for making cement and steel, things that need super hot temperatures that are not produced by regular reactors. Am I right about that?
That's one of the other really exciting things about it, is that some of the higher temperature advanced reactors can be used for, you can use the process heat directly for industrial manufacturing. So instead of having outlet temperatures on the order of 300, 330 degrees Celsius, like the conventional plants, some of these go up to 800 degrees Celsius, even 900 degrees Celsius and beyond. And so you could use those for direct production of hydrogen, for example, and can sort of like cut out the middleman of electricity production and get very, very high efficiency chemical processing, which is immensely useful for rapidly developing countries.
Yeah, I understand too that they're very good for load following. So, I mean, you tell me if I'm right about this. I remember Kurt Sorensen saying that you could turn it on and turn it off just like you turn off a light switch. Is that true of the MSR, or is he just talking about the thorium reactors?
I think that to some degree, liquid fueled reactors, like whether it's a uranium molten salt reactor or a thorium molten salt reactor, they can be better at load following than solid fueled reactors, but you're not going to get the same load following abilities as like a natural gas plant, for example. You can load follow with an MSR on, say, 24-hour cycles, but really I see the role of nuclear in the future as being for baseload power generation. And then use something like solar or wind coupled with better forms of storage to do the topping on top of the baseload.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. The sodium, the idea that it could happen doesn't mean it would happen.
Exactly. Yeah, and
yeah.
the sodium reactor, there's so much operational experience. You worry about preventing leaks, but there's a very good engineering and operations handle on how you manage that. So it's slightly easier to do load following, especially on 24-hour cycles with a liquid fueled reactor as opposed to a solid fueled reactor. If you have a liquid fueled reactor, whether it's a uranium fueled molten salt reactor or a thorium fueled molten salt reactor, there's the potential to do some load following there, which is definitely a benefit of that type of technology. It's not quite as easy to do load following with any type of nuclear plant as it would be to do load following with, for example, a natural gas plant. It's just harder to ramp up and ramp down the power in any type of nuclear plant. Their key difference is that they use a liquid fuel that also serves as the primary coolant in the reactor.
Also, in a light water reactor, the control rods in their positions control the rate of energy, right? So what controls the rate in a molten salt reactor?
Well, in a molten salt reactor, in some designs, you can reposition moderator rods within the reactor to change what the power profile looks like. And that's something I like, especially because that it's effectively completely inverting what a traditional light water reactor looks like, because there you have the solid fuel with liquid water surrounding it as coolant and moderator, and then in a thermal spectrum molten salt reactor you have liquid fuel with solid moderator rods inside of it.
So in general, Gen 4 reactors, depending on the design, are closer to fruition. Maybe you could specify which ones are closest.
So there are different companies and different technologies, as you said, that are at different stages of development for Generation 4 reactors. And there are approximately 100 different Generation 4 reactor development efforts that are going on right now. So there are many, many shots on goal. There's a fantastic study released by the DC think tank Third Way that just had a new update that came out, I believe, in August, just a few months ago, that's detailing all of the different Gen 4 reactor design efforts that are going on. Broadly speaking, all of these companies, all of these development efforts are planning on coming to fruition in the 2020s and 2030s, more shifted towards the 2030s end of the spectrum. And broadly speaking, the sodium fast reactors and to some degree the gas-cooled reactors are at a higher level of development, a higher technology readiness level. actually, one company in particular, TerraPower, which is backed by Bill Gates and based in Bellevue, Washington, they just established a joint venture with the China National Nuclear Corporation, which will substantially accelerate their development timeline. And they're working on a traveling wave reactor, which is a type of sodium fast reactor. So it's really exciting to me to see how they're moving ahead very quickly with their technology and also partnering with other countries to get this done where the need is the greatest.
Is that the same as an integral fast reactor?
Oh yeah, an integral fast reactor is also a type of metal-cooled reactor.
And they have plans to put commercial Gen 4 reactors up already for China right now.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was last week or week before last that they made their public announcement about the joint venture and their plans for the next steps there. That is really, really accelerating the timeline for their technology and putting the pressure on everyone else, honestly, to keep up.
Once these prototypes are constructed, are they going to actually be operating cheaper than coal, or they're not there yet?
Well, many of the different technologies promise to be cheaper than coal and hope to be cheaper than coal. But I think it's something that we won't know for sure until we have a plant up and running, until we have those actual numbers in hand. Because a great deal of the cost is driven by the baseline technology, by the reactor core technology itself, and how you implement that into a plant design. But another substantial factor of the cost is what type of supply chain you have for key materials. So what's going to be the cost of the lithium in your salt, or do you need to do any substantial enrichment of the uranium in your fuel? And what's that going to cost? And so to some degree, it's these interesting feedback effects where if you have a really robust nuclear supply chain within the US and worldwide, that will allow for lower plant costs, lower construction costs for all the advanced reactor techs.
All right. So tell us a little bit about your company, Transatomic.
Absolutely. So my co-founder, Mark Massey, and I first started talking about Transatomic back in 2010, 2011. This is when we were grad students in nuclear engineering still. We were really excited about what the future of the nuclear industry might look like. We had been reading about and talking about other types of advanced nuclear reactor technologies, and we wanted to get involved in that as well. We thought we really support all the benefits of nuclear power. We want to find a way to do it better. We want to find a way to address the safety and waste and proliferation and cost issues and make a reactor that people would want to have in their backyards, even in their neighborhoods, in their cities, and empowering their homes. In parallel with that, we were especially excited about molten salt reactor technology. We had been reading extensively about the molten salt reactor experiment out of the Oak Ridge National Lab in the 1960s, early 1970s. We loved the safety benefits that it had, and we wanted to find a way to look at that design and adapt it and improve it if possible and find a way to commercialize it.
Is that a modular reactor? Could they be mass produced once you have it developed?
The design that we're working on isn't strictly speaking a modular reactor. The main design that we're working on would be 520 megawatts electric. So it's too large to be considered a SMR, a small modular reactor, strictly speaking. But our design and a wide variety of the advanced nuclear technologies could be manufactured in a more modular way. I think there's a lot that you can draw on there, and that would serve to substantially decrease the cost of advanced nuclear reactors if you can mass produce a lot of the components at a central location and then ship them off by rail car, for example, to where they'll eventually be installed.
Okay, just for our listeners, how powerful is 500 megawatt reactor?
500 megawatt reactor, that's about the size of the coal power plants that are being shut down in the US right now. That's partly why we targeted that particular size. We wanted to be the right size to replace the coal power plants that are coming offline in the US and serve as an alternative for coal power plants that would otherwise be built in other parts of the world. That's enough to power a medium-sized city.
Okay.
So it's grid scale.
So I understand that you can use used fuel in your reactor, what some people might call waste.
We had initially thought that we were able to consume spent nuclear fuel, but then we realized approximately a year and a half ago that we weren't able to do that with our design. So our design right now focuses on running off of low enriched fresh uranium fuel, 5% enriched fresh uranium fuel. So the baseline technology for the molten salt reactor, started as an experimental reactor by Dr. Alvin Weinberg in the late 1950s. And that particular technology, with its immense safety benefits, its atmospheric pressure operation as well, was something that my co-founder and I were fascinated by. And that was really the genesis for Transatomic.
That's good. Even he thought of it as a game changer back then, I think. The idea that you could have passive safety.
Molten salt reactors and other types of advanced reactor technologies as well can be described as being passively safe. So that means that if you lose electric power to the facility, for example, or in some cases, even if there aren't any operators on site, the reactors are able to shut themselves down effectively, which greatly reduces the risk of an accident on the site.
Yeah, meltdowns become impossible from a physics point of view.
I'm always wary of using the phrase meltdown when talking about molten salt reactors, since they start out molten.
There are quite a few companies that are trying to produce molten salt reactors. The number is hard to keep track of, but at least 4 or 5 in North America. Can you tell us how yours is unique or different from the others?
Certainly. So, Wyatt, I think there are at least 10 or maybe even 12 different companies all working on different types of molten salt reactor technologies. The commonality among all of us is that we use liquid fuel rather than solid fuel. And some of the companies are working on, say, thorium molten salt reactor designs. Some are working on plutonium molten salt reactor designs. And others, like ours, are using uranium fuel in our molten salt reactor. So the key difference with Transatomic's design is that we're using low enriched fresh uranium fuel, so enriched to 5% uranium-235.
Mm-hmm.
Which means?
So that means that we're able to use the existing fuel cycle for uranium within the US. And we definitely recognize the benefits of the thorium fuel cycle in particular, but for us, we believe it's a quicker step towards commercialization if we're able to take advantage of the existing uranium supply chain and use the same fuel as the conventional reactors do within the US. And what we're able to do with that fuel is, in our molten salt reactor, we're able to get more than twice the burnup, twice the fuel utilization as compared to a conventional light water reactor using the same type of 5% enriched fuel. And in consequence, we leave behind less than half of the long-lived waste as compared to a conventional light water reactor.
I don't know if I'd be getting into too much detail, but would it be where you put the fuel in and leave it for years before you do a refueling?
Yes, effectively. It's always tricky to some degree to talk about what the refueling schedule is for a liquid-fueled reactor as compared to a solid-fueled reactor. You can imagine for a liquid-fueled reactor that you'd be continuously adding in fresh fuel and then continuously removing waste products, removing fission products in particular from the liquid-fueled reactor. But with the liquid-fueled reactor, in just about every case, you're able to leave the fuel in the reactor for much longer, in some cases twice as long or maybe even more than that as compared to a conventional reactor. And so if you're leaving the fuel in the reactor for longer, you're able to consume more of its energy and therefore leave behind less of the long-lived waste.
I've heard that you don't have to stop the reactor to refuel it, and maybe that's something to do with it being a liquid.
Theory, yes. Though that's something that engineering-wise, operations-wise, it could be very tricky to implement. We think that because you can say, well, you can just leave your liquid-fueled reactor operating continuously and trickle in fresh uranium fuel, for example, and never have to shut down. I think that in practice, at least in the first iterations of that, you're going to want to have something analogous to typical refueling stops for a liquid-fueled reactor. You'd want to stop the reactor, drain out the liquid fuel, check whether there's any maintenance requirements for the internals of the reactor core, more fresh fuel, and then remelt the salt, put it back into the reactor core. So I think at least in the first few iterations, it'd be tricky to operate continuously.
They are, in some ways, more proliferation safe by design.
One of the especially interesting things about advanced reactor technologies is that they will likely require different ways of looking at material safeguards and materials controls, especially for liquid fueled reactors. Materials accountability for a solid fueled reactor, it's pretty straightforward to just count the number of spent fuel assemblies that you have in your facility. If one is missing, that's a substantial problem. But then if you have a liquid fueled reactor, it's much harder to tell if you're missing a few ounces of a liquid. If you're missing, I think there's great potential for new advanced nuclear reactor technologies to bake in better material safeguards and anti-proliferation techniques into the designs at the early stage. But we all advanced nuclear reactor designers need to think very hard about what those would look like and what's the most robust way to implement them going forward.
How far away are you from actually breaking ground on your first commercial prototype?
Yeah, so for this one, I don't want to give any exact numbers on this front yet. In line with what the other advanced reactor companies are looking at. So we're aiming to break ground first on a prototype facility. It's most likely within the United States. And then after we finish building and operating the prototype facility, then we would move forward to the development of a full-scale commercial facility.
That's another reason you chose uranium fuel. Easier for regulate. Right?
Yes, exactly. There's much more precedent for using uranium fuel there.
Probably less technical hurdles too, I bet.
Yes, there's much more of a knowledge base around using the uranium fuel.
Is there a way our viewers could support your efforts?
Oh, thank you for asking about that. There are two things that I can think of. So one of them is that I think that more people just need to know about advanced nuclear technology and how it's different and that it's different from the conventional nuclear reactors that exist today. So one thing that listeners can do is just read more about different types of advanced reactor technologies that exist and have conversations with their friends and their families and people they know about nuclear and what it might mean for them. The next step also would be talking to your congressional representatives and saying that you know about advanced nuclear technology, you support advanced nuclear technology, and that you think it can have great benefits in terms of both increasing carbon-free electricity production and increasing American competitiveness in the energy sector.
Now, if any of our viewers have money to invest,
Oh, yes, they should certainly talk to me about that. Sorry, that last
that's the most important thing.
apologize.
Well, Dr. Dewan, we want to thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to be on our podcast today.
Thank you so much.
And now for our final thoughts. The new fire tells the story of the cutting-edge nuclear technologies that hold the potential to revolutionize not only the way we make energy, but the things that advanced super cheap energy can do.
While too cheap to meter is a much maligned term, it was never meant to be applied to existing nuclear power, but was quoted with an eye towards the future.
That future may be closer than we think, but to achieve it, we must think big. The only thing standing in the way of that dream of limitless power is our own short-sightedness.
Given the seriousness of our present climate crisis, there is an urgent need to achieve the goal of super safe, super abundant, and reliable clean energy through advanced nuclear power now. It is our only hope for a clean break from our fossil fuel addiction.
Whether we choose to recognize it or not, we are in a race against time. We encourage our listeners to not only go see this great film, but also to urge Congress to go full stop on advanced nuclear power development research now. What's desperately needed in these times is boldness in action, and the time to act is now.
And that's it for our show today. If you have any comments, criticisms, or suggestions, feel free to email us at ecomodernistpodcast@gmail.com. You can also join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please subscribe to us on iTunes for more great shows.
This is Gabe Ignetti.
And this is Rick Maltese.
We will be seeing you till next time.